So now I want to introduce our featured speaker today, Jeff Cohlberg. And he was with us several years ago in January 2019, speaking on the same subject. But at the time, he was, as we said, he joined the Citizens Climate Lobby in 2016 when he retired from being a professor at Cal State Long Beach. And at the time, the focus of the Citizens Climate Lobby, which I'll say CCL, was more narrow than it is today. And he's going to get into what it has expanded to. It's a nonprofit, it's a nonpartisan grassroots advocacy climate change organization. And now it's focused on price on carbon, healthy forests, building electrification and efficiency, and clean energy permitting reform. So I want to welcome Jeff Cohlberg with no more further ado. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Amy.
You just do the arrows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me back. And I'm a scientist, but I'm a biochemist by profession. I'm not a climate scientist, not an expert on climate policy, but hopefully I have kept well enough informed on these issues that I can present this and answer your questions. So today I want to talk a little bit about Citizens Climate Lobby, what that organization is, and then talk about what the Inflation Reduction Act accomplished in terms of helping us meet our climate goals, and then how carbon pricing, carbon fee and dividend can help us eliminate carbon emissions, and then talk about the newer focus of CCL, and that is permitting reform. And then finally say a few words about a new branch of CCL, CCL California. So CCL is a nonpartisan organization. It has greater than 600 chapters in the US. And for many years, we've advocated a bipartisan policy of carbon fee and dividend to address climate change. We lobby all members of Congress, both House and Senate, and we try and build support in local communities for the policies that we advocate. And our policy agenda now consists of 4 areas. One is carbon pricing. A second, which I'm going to say a lot about today, is clean energy permitting reform. And also, I'll say less about these, but healthy forests and building electrification and efficiency. So the Inflation Reduction Act was a big step forward in the fight against climate change. And there is a forecast that it will achieve a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2030. How does it do this? It gives tax credits for clean energy. There is a methane pollution fee. There are tax incentives for purchasers of electric vehicles, incentives and credits for building electrification and efficiency, and then direct support of forests, of projects involving forests and agriculture, and direct support of clean technology innovation and domestic manufacturing. So as a result of the IRA, in the year 2030, up to 85% of our electricity will be from clean sources. We're going to have a lot more electric vehicles on the road than we would have otherwise, and about 1 million new jobs in clean energy, clean manufacturing, and building retrofits. So this graph shows greenhouse gas emissions in terms of CO2 equivalents from 2005 to 2020. Without the Inflation Reduction Action, business as usual, the forecast is that we would have had by 2030 only an overall 27% cut in greenhouse gas emissions. As a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, we're forecast a 40% reduction. So this is different models giving a range of projections. And of course, the Paris target is 50% reduction by the year 2030. So we still have a way to go, and we need more measures to combat climate change. So one of the policies that CCL has long advocated is carbon pricing. We advocate for a carbon fee and dividend with a carbon border adjustment mechanism to lower emissions and deliver clean energy. So there's a bill in Congress that was just reintroduced just a few weeks ago, the Energy Innovation Act and Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Polluters pay, and people get a carbon cashback. And its co-sponsors are two congressmen from California, Representatives Carbajal and Peters. And the way it works is you charge a fee on fossil fuels at the source, and that fee is paid by the coal companies, the oil companies, the natural gas companies. But instead of keeping that fee, the government returns 100% of the net revenue to households as a carbon cashback. So what does the fee starts out low, and it grows over time. It starts at $15 per ton of CO2 emitted and goes up $10 per year. And it can be adjusted further if necessary to meet the emissions goals. And what will happen as a result of the fee is fossil fuels become more expensive. And energy companies, given a choice of different sources for their energy, will move to renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. Transportation companies will switch to electric vehicles. Coal mines and oil refineries will scale back and shut down. And consumers who have choices to make about what they buy will choose what's cheaper. And if goods produced with lower carbon emissions are cheaper, consumers will switch to those goods as well. But one of the problems with this is if you put a price on carbon, then everything that depends on fossil fuel consumption, their prices will go up and the cost of living goes up. So in order to cope with the increased cost of living, the net revenue connected from the carbon fee is allocated in equal shares every month to all all residents of the US. And it's not peanuts. The expected dividend after 5 years for a family of four is $200 a month. So this can make a real difference in people's ability to afford the increased cost of living. And about 2/3 of US households, the ones with the lowest carbon profile, will come out ahead. Their cashback will be greater than the increase in the cost of living. And if you take, I don't have the newest data, but the old 44th Congressional District, which was represented by Nanette Barragan, a working class area largely, San Pedro and the port area and some of the areas north of San Pedro. In that district, about 84% of the households come out ahead, and only the top 7% experience a net loss greater than 0.2% of their income. $100,000, 0.2% is $200. So in addition, there's a border carbon adjustment. If American companies are paying have greater costs because of the carbon fee, they could be at a competitive disadvantage with respect to foreign manufacturers. So imported goods will pay a border carbon adjustment, and goods exported from the US will receive a refund. So that's basically how the carbon fee and dividend works. There's a simulator, and this was developed by some people at a firm called Climate Interactive in collaboration with folks at MIT. And it's a simulation of the world economy. And it shows you the different fuels consumed: coal, oil, natural gas, renewables, and nuclear, and shows how that will change as a function of time. And then it also shows the rise in global temperature as a function of time. So business as usual, the There will be an increase in the use of renewables, but really not much reduction. Whoops. Not much reduction in the use of fossil fuels, and global temperature will go up about 3.4 degrees Celsius, or 6 degrees Fahrenheit, 6.1 degrees Fahrenheit.
I want to point out the sliders. Jeff, could you stand over
To the other side? Oh, okay. So yes, so what you can do, and I can do this in an interactive mode, but to save time, I'm showing you some things that I've done in advance. You can say, well, what would the various policies do in terms of reducing carbon emissions and temperature? So we can ask, what if we restricted deforestation and eliminated deforestation, and we planted 1 trillion trees? People have suggested. And if you do that, the temperature doesn't go down very much, 3.1 degrees instead of 3.4 degrees. And if you take just about any one of these individual policies, you will see only modest reductions in the temperature. On the other hand, if you apply a carbon tax, there's a full drop from 3.4 degrees to 2.4 degrees. And a price on carbon is the single most effective policy in terms of reducing carbon emissions. If we had a global Inflation Reduction Act, if all the countries in the world adopted similar policies, that would bring the temperature down to 2.0 Celsius. So as a result of increased energy efficiency, total energy usage goes down, and now we see decreases in fossil fuels along with increase in renewables.
Jeff, I didn't touch you.
Sorry?
Someone's calling. Somebody.
I don't, oh, sorry. Let me,
Maybe it's my.
this is muted, but, okay.
Kind of remember to speak to the microphone.
Speak to this microphone, to that microphone. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Question, is this available online, that graph, the interactive graph?
There's, if you Google En-ROADS, EN-ROADS, you get to the site where you have the interactive tool.
Thank you.
So if we have a global IRA plus a global carbon price, that would get us down to 1.7 degrees Celsius, and that's really close to the Paris goal. And then if you make have some additional policies from some of these other tools, it's conceivable that we could get down to a net increase of 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial times. So just want to remind you that among the endorsers of the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act are the Palos Verdes Democrats from 2019. So there's, in the last Congress, so the Energy Innovation Act is not the only carbon pricing bill that's been in Congress. And from the last Congress, this is an example of another approach. Instead of returning all of the money as a fee to households, the Save Our Futures Act with Senator Whitehouse returns part of the fee as a tax credit for low-income taxpayers and spends the remaining revenue on energy affordability and pollution reduction in environmental justice communities, and in addition spends money on transition costs for fossil fuel workers. And this approach has maybe a little more appeal to environmental justice communities, and so there are a variety of different approaches. Our favorite bill is this one, but it's not the only one that's been proposed. And also there have been some bills in Congress concerning a carbon border adjustment independent of a carbon fee. And the argument from Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, for example, is that the Chinese steel and chemicals are produced with lower environmental standards than the cleaner American production, and they should pay even though we don't have a carbon fee, they should still pay some sort of a border adjustment when those goods are incorporated. And there's a variety of different approaches, by both Republicans and Democrats. One bill that has bipartisan support is the Prove It Act, and it directs the Department of Energy to study carbon emissions intensity of covered products produced in U.S. compared to other countries. So this would be gathering the data as a first step in the imposition of some sort of border carbon adjustment. And this is a complicated issue, and maybe we can return to that in the Q&A period. So the second area of major concern for CCL is energy permitting reform. We work to increase America's capacity to transmit clean energy and speed up the approval of clean energy projects while preserving communities' ability to give input. So why is transmission so critical? Solar and wind projects are set to explode thanks to the tax credits in the IRA. But big wind and solar farms tend to be located away from the households and businesses that need clean power. So transmission lines are needed to connect it to, but often take a decade to build. So it takes an average of 4.5 years for federal agencies to complete environmental impact statements for major energy projects. And transmission line approval now takes an average of 10 years. So we want to have this very rapid transformation of our economy and our energy system, and we're faced with these terrible timelines, and we need to triple our current capacity to transmit clean electricity by 2050. So, and if we don't start building clean energy infrastructure faster, we'll only achieve about 20% of the potential carbon pollution reduction from climate policy that's already in place. So CCL supports policies that add to our capacity to transmit clean energy, that speed up the approval process of energy projects waiting to be built, but preserve communities' ability to make their voices heard on the impacts of these proposed projects on their communities. So there was some permitting reform in the debt ceiling bill that happened earlier this year. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, was streamlined to make regulatory agencies more efficient. I'll talk about that more on the next slide. And unfortunately, because we had to satisfy Joe Manchin of West Virginia, that deal also included approval of the Mountain Valley Pipeline.
Is that pipeline in West Virginia?
Yes. It goes from West Virginia across Virginia to, is it just those two states? I can't remember. So the NEPA reforms would, I won't go through all of this, but it designates a lead energy when there are multiple agencies involved. It puts timelines on the environmental assessment and environmental impact statements, and does other things that make the approval process more efficient, more rapid. So what about that policy? Well, yes, it speeds up the approval of clean energy projects, but it doesn't specifically mention energy transmission lines. It talks more about energy, both fossil fuel and solar and wind. And it says nothing about communities' ability to make their voices heard. So clearly more has to be done. So what do progressives still want to see in a permitting reform bill? They want to see early community involvement, more interregional transmission capacity between different regions of the country, which becomes particularly important when there's a climate emergency, fire or something that causes a widespread power outage. They want to see establishing liaisons with environmental communities. I won't go through all of this, but there's a whole wish list of things that progressives want to see that they don't have yet. And conservatives also have a wish list. They want to shorten the statute of limitations for bringing lawsuits against a project, so that if a project starts and somebody's going to sue to stop it, it'll happen soon rather than 8 years down the line. They want to limit the scope of the Clean Water Act, and there are certain things that they want to see included. And there have been a whole bunch of permitting reform bills introduced into Congress. And I just listed a few of them here. There was H.R. 1 submitted by the House Republicans, and there are other proposals, some submitted by Republicans and others submitted by Democrats. In this page, citizensclimatelobby.org, Clean Energy Permitting Reform in Congress, has a list of 10 bills that are being considered. So clearly, there's a room for everybody wants to see permitting reform, and they have different priorities. And there actually is a possibility for Democrats and Republicans to get together. Oh, I almost forgot, a bill that CCL is currently strongly advocating for is the Big Wires Act. And it's an acronym for Building Integrated Grids with Interregional Energy Supply. Directs the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to coordinate construction of an interregional transmission system, so that if there's abundant energy in electricity in one region, and it needs to be sent to another region, that can happen efficiently. And it establishes a minimum transfer requirement, which requires regions of the country to be able to transfer at least 30% of their peak electrical loads with other regions. And it's up to each region of the country to develop a plan. So right now, this is a very high priority of CCL trying to convince members of Congress to vote for this bill. So both parties see the potential for a comprehensive permitting reform bill. The debt ceiling deal was a nice start, but it's modest and much more is needed. And this slide, this is a slide from a talk that was given in June. Negotiations are expected to continue throughout the summer. Well, we know that what happened to Congress over the course of the summer and early fall, things are not quite as functional as we thought they were, but nevertheless, I'll come back to it. There's a slide that's out of order there. So I just want to say, just a second, okay, here's the slide that was out of order. So will Congress actually get anything done in this area of permitting reform? And there are a couple of reasons for hope. First of all, there's something called this Climate Solutions Congress, groups of senators and representatives who are committed to finding solutions for the climate crisis. It was founded in 2016 and really hadn't been doing anything since 2018. And it was relaunched in July. And there's a group, senators, 7 Democrats and 6 Republicans. In the House, 32 of each Democrats and Republicans, who are meeting, talking about the climate crisis. In late September, the House Climate Solutions Caucus had a meeting where they invited people from CCL to come and tell them about permitting reform and why that's so important. So, and it's very interesting. I looked at the membership of the House, and it includes Matt Gaetz from Florida. Whatever else you can say about him, he has publicly indicated his concern for the climate crisis. So the other reason for hope is that there is going to be, at some point, a bipartisan agreement to keep the government going. We don't know what it will take to get that, but that will happen. And as a result, to reach that bipartisan agreement, there's going to be a lot of deal making. And this is the place where people from both parties try and get their priorities. And that's why some permitting reform was in the debt ceiling agreement. So this is going to happen towards the end of the year, and that perhaps is the best hope for getting something like this actually passed.
Jeff, is that the caucus where they would only admit Republicans, Democrats, and terrorists?
Yes. So it looks like, well,
Somebody left.
it's 7 and 6. I don't know why that is, but yeah. So it's a Democrat can only join if he brings a Republican with him. So the other, just want to mention briefly the other legislative priorities of CCL. One is healthy forests. We support preserving and expanding forests and climate-smart forestry, as well as advocating for increasing urban forests with a focus on neighborhoods that are negatively impacted from a lack of tree equity. And in that regard, there's one bill that CCL strongly supported last year and was passed in December, and that's the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which facilitates participation of farmers and other people in voluntary environmental credit markets. And then we were also supporting the Forest Act, which restricts imports of products made of commodities produced on land undergoing illegal deforestation. That was a bill in last year's Congress. It has not yet been introduced into this year's Congress, but we're anticipating its reintroduction. And when it does introduce, we intend to support that very enthusiastically. In building electrification and efficiency, we're not really focusing on the legislative side, but we are educating the public and elected officials on the importance of electrification and efficiency and how they can accelerate the transition to clean energy buildings with attention to supporting low and middle income households in that transition. I just want to mention a couple of other proposed laws. One is a bill that has been introduced for quite a long time by Ted Lieu. It requires 100% electricity from renewable sources by 2035 and zero carbon emissions by 2050. It doesn't really specify a mechanism or provide any funding, any specific funding for those goals, but it makes those goals part of the law. And then also proposed by Senator Alex Bezia, and then two of our local congressmen, Robert Garcia from the Long Beach area and Nanette Barragan from San Pedro, is the Clean Shipping Act. So a really substantial part of carbon pollution and pollution in general are the ports. And this bill would let the EPA regulate carbon intensity standards for maritime fuel, and it would require cuts in carbon emissions from ships in U.S. ports beginning in 2027 and reaching zero by 2040. And if we got zero emission from ships at the ports, it would be have a profound effect on our air quality. Whoops. Sorry. Oh yeah, finally, CCL until a little less than a year ago had focused exclusively on national policy and what could get accomplished in the U.S. Congress. And more recently, they've decided to focus also on state and local legislation. So this group, CCL California, has now formed, and they're going to have a network of lobbyists to lobby every member of the California Senate and Assembly to build relationships with their staff. And Connie Sullivan, it turns out, is the liaison for both Senator Ben Allen and Assemblyman Al Muratsuchi. So that is something that has just been going on recently, and we want to focus on passing the most effective state legislation needed to address the climate crisis and develop technical expertise to help legislators understand the solutions to the climate crisis and build relationships with other climate organizations. So currently there's one bill that CCL is lobbying for, and that is proposed by our Al Muratsuchi. It's Assembly Bill 858, a climate cashback fund from cap and trade. So the way cap and trade works, the money that is received from the cap and trade auctions goes into something called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And that money supports programs that reduce carbon emissions. Right now, that the revenue from in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is getting close to $4 billion a year. And according to this bill, any revenue exceeding $4 billion would go to a California cashback fund. And the Franchise Tax Board would make annual payments of $100 a person to people in the state from the California Climate Cashback Fund, starting with the lowest income residents and getting higher. So just as in the carbon fee and dividend, the cashback helps people cope with the increased cost of living as a result of the fee. This fund would help people cope with the increased cost of fossil fuels as a result of the cap and trade program. And it also creates a climate cashback access board to advise the Franchise Tax Board on how to maximize equity and benefit to all California residents. So just in closing, we have, it used to be the Long Beach South Bay chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. This March, the two chapters split, and we now have separate chapters for Long Beach and the South Bay. So we're just beginning to build up the South Bay chapter. We lobby congressional representatives. We have a group that meets with Maxine Waters and her staff, and another group in connection with the West LA chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby that meets with Ted Lieu and his staff. We write letters to the editor. We do tabling at community events. We speak at meetings of local organizations, as I'm doing today. We're planning a youth and campus outreach. I should say that I've seen what the Palos Verdes, the student, I'm forgetting the name of the group.
Student Environmental Advocacy.
Student Environmental Advocates, what that group has done with, apparently with a lot of the help from the PV Democrats, and it's quite impressive. And so CCL would also like to make some efforts to get connected with young people. And we have congressional lobbying. We get endorsements from community leaders. We have congressional lobbying events in Washington, D.C. twice a year, and people go to Washington and actually meet with representatives in their D.C. offices. So that's about all I want to say. I just want to, I'll pass these around. These are sheets, there's 3 of them. The first one is on permitting reform, and the other 2 are on the carbon fee and dividend. And if you want to find out more, there's a QR code. And if you scan it with your phone, it'll take you to a website that has more detailed information. And also on that website, there's an opportunity to sign up and with CCL and join the chapter So if anyone's interested in doing that.
So if you give me a soft copy of that, I'll make sure it's in our newsletter.
Okay.
A soft copy. Send me a,
Right.
yeah.
I can do that.
A PDF.
Yeah, so I'll pass
You
these
can
around
pass this
today.
for here, but for the people who are on Zoom and for people who read our newsletter, we could, if you send me your PDF version of it, okay?
Okay, I will do that.
That'd be great.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, so as usual, we'll do questions also from here in the room and also on Zoom. But before we get to that, I did want to recognize that. So from the South, I have you here. Wally, maybe you could just unmute and say hello. Wally Siembe.
Yes, hi.
Yeah. Why don't you introduce yourself?
South Bay City's Council of Governments. And I'll have some questions, but why don't you go ahead and take questions from the room, and then I will.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeff.
I want to stop sharing here, and so we'll see. Okay. All right.
Okay, David, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was wondering where that 30% margin came from on sharing energy between regional segments. That's a huge margin to put on top of a generation capacity.
I don't know, I'm not a power engineer or, I don't know the technical aspects of it, but that's what they came up with.
People worry about a few percent or fractions of a percent, in the power business.
I don't know. The people who wrote that bill must think that that's practical and achievable, but I don't really know. Yeah.
Yes, last year the Supreme Court limited stationary power plants, or limited the EPA from regulating stationary power plants in terms of emission of CO2. Has CCL taken a position on that, or they come out publicly and said that they oppose the decision of the Supreme Court to do that?
And just so that the people on Zoom can hear the question, could you repeat the question?
Oh, okay. The question was that last year the Supreme Court issued a decision that the EPA could not regulate emissions from stationary power plants. Has CCL taken a position on that? I have to plead ignorance on that. I simply am not, I vaguely know about that issue, but I don't really know about details. And I haven't heard anything from CCL specifically on that.
Another question is, does CCL know of any recent studies indicating the health risk for people who are adjacent to high transmission power lines? I know this is a somewhat controversial issue. Are there any recent studies that you're aware of on this?
I'm not. I know CCL says that if we clean up pollution, there will be a huge benefit in terms of health, but in terms of people living near power lines, that I'm not aware of. Yeah.
Specifically, this tree equity referred to, is that per capita? It was on the slide.
Oh, well, the idea is that, I'm sorry, in the tree equity that was referred to on one of the slides, is that per capita? Was the question. I think the idea is just that people living in some of the high density areas of Los Angeles are in areas where there are very few trees, and that their areas are actually hotter as a result, that the trees have a cooling effect. And aside from people waiting for buses and having to sit in the sun and things like that. And I think the idea is that we just need to plant more trees in these areas and have South Central LA look more like Palos Verdes. Yeah.
You said Matt Gaetz was involved in the caucus.
I know.
Yeah. Now, was he there to be productive, or is he there to interfere?
I don't know. I just saw that there's also, I can't remember her name, another provocateur, a woman who's been in the news, not Marjorie Taylor Greene, but
Warren Boebert?
Mace is also a member of the Climate Solutions Caucus. I don't know whether to take that as a good sign or a bad sign, because if they're going to gum up the works by being obstinate, and that's a bad sign. On the other hand, if they're serious, it is possible to be. Well, I shouldn't really say, because CCL is a nonpartisan organization. So I'm not representing CCL right now. I'm speaking as me. But, maybe it's a good sign that people who are just such, I'm trying to think of a polite word, such jerks as Matt Gaetz can actually, it's possible for somebody to be a jerk and have horrendous ideas about governance and still be concerned with the climate. So maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. I'd like to be optimistic.
He's from a state that's about to be submerged.
Well, I think that may be part of it. That people in Florida, in general, are more conscious of the climate crisis than people in the United States in general. So that may have something to do with it. I don't know. Maybe we should call him and ask him. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment, going back to the question about tree planting in the southeast part of the Paul has announced the program.
Why don't you come up and you can, that would be, since you're making a statement, talk to the mic.
I don't want to interrupt you guys.
No.
So Metropolitan Water District has just announced a tree planting program that they're going to subsidize to a tune of several $1 million a year. Tree planting in southeastern Los Angeles that is lacking trees. And why would a water agency do that? And exactly what you said, it's the temperature of the air is absorbing more moisture, drying out the land. And if you look at the Colorado River and the Sacramento Delta water, we're getting years where we have normal stormwater. We're only getting half of the normal runoff from that as a result of warmer air absorbs more water. So I just wanted to
Thank you.
mention that.
Any questions on Zoom from the Zoom attendees?
Is there a chat? Or?
No, I am looking at chat.
Oh, I see.
But while we're waiting, I do have some good news. So I always like to.
Please, I want to hear some good.
Yeah, I made a list of the good news. I thought with the potential war going on that we need to breathe and hear some good news. So I'm an avid reader of LA Times Sammy Ross Boiling Point column, and he just reported in his last column, he said, after nearly 2 years of negotiations, a coalition of solar companies, conservationists, and other groups have come to terms on a set of principles and plans for further collaboration that can speed up the construction of badly needed renewable energy projects while also protecting wildlife habitat, preserving treasured landscapes, and benefiting nearby communities. And this has to do with the transmission lines that Jeff was talking about, is that they're talking about, where a lot of times the people who want to do the building of the transmission lines and the environmentalists have been at each other's throats on this, but we're talking about going down interstates, utilizing places where you're not affecting the environment, and they've built a coalition now. And so we're hopefully that will get the permitting that you need to build the transmission line. So that was
There's a lot of land both on highways and also the canals.
and also the canals. So they're talking here in California, we're talking about doing it on the canals and
But Sammy hasn't really been a friend of presidential solar.
He's for compromise, so I think. Anyway, so I'm not looking at, okay, so as I'm going to talk some more good news. So these have to do with our local bills. So Senate Bill 253, that's going to require, these are ones that just got signed by Newsom. So Newsom signed a bunch of bills, and there are a bunch of them that support the climate. So this one will require big companies to disclose how much planet warming carbon they're spewing into the atmosphere. So now we'll know. And then there's another bill. I'm not going to AB 1167. That's going to strengthen requirements for oil companies to plug the old wells. You know, I mean, they need to take ownership of that. AB 1305, that's going to require new transparency and disclosure requirements for buyers and sellers of carbon offsets, thus making it harder for companies to exaggerate the climate benefits of their investments in protecting forests and keeping carbon out of the atmosphere. So he did sign that one. He did not sign SB 390, which would have further cracked down on sketchy climate claims by making it illegal to sell offsets that don't actually keep carbon out of the atmosphere. So that still needs work. I know CCL works hard on carbon offsets as well. So anyway, so we made a little bit of a dent there. Another bill that he signed, this is AB 1373. This was designed to get the state's first offshore wind farms built, and maybe some geothermal power plants too, by allowing a state agency to sign long-term contracts to buy electricity from those facilities on behalf of all Californians. So another one, this is SB 605. This will require state officials to study the possibility of generating electricity from our waves and tides. In the Scandinavian countries, they are doing that, right?
Oh, yeah.
So we don't have to study too hard. We can learn from them.
They're also doing it down at Alta Sea.
That's right. That's right. They're doing it down at Alta Sea in Long Beach. That's part of it. AB 1132, this will extend existing caps on permitting fees for rooftop solar systems. So he signed that. SB 355, this would ensure continued funding for solar panels on low-income housing. SB 49 directed state officials to study the potential for solar panels along highways where it could be easier and faster to build them in the desert. And SB 337, which will commit to state law the goal of protecting 30% of California lands and waters by 2030. So we had a meeting back in May of 2022 with Dr. Jennifer Norris, who spoke about this 30 by 30 strategy, and which is endorsed by scientists and biodiversity advocates around the world. So by him signing it, by Newsom and by also President Biden, both embracing 30 by 30, it's now law here in California. Before it was an executive order, so now it was passed into law. So anyway, there was a bunch of others, but just the highlights of good things that have been happening in the signing of the laws by Newsom and what California is doing.
Jeff, could
Yeah.
you say something a little bit about the local CCL chapter, the new one, the South Bay one? Where do you meet and who's running it?
So we, our group leader is Edric Geis, and he was the group leader of the Long Beach South Bay chapter. He's now moved to El Segundo, so he's now a South Bay resident. We had our first in-person meeting yesterday, and that was at an office building in El Segundo. We're looking for locations that might be a little more central to people living in this part of the South Bay. But it was a hybrid in-person Zoom meeting. We meet the second Saturday of every month. If we continue the current format, it'll be 9:45 to 12. There's a meet and greet at 9:45. At 10 o'clock, we hear a video presentation from the national CCL, which usually lasts about 40 minutes, and then we spend the rest of the period from 10:40 to 12 talking about our local matters.
I was just gonna say, we have a question from Juan.
Yeah.
On Zoom. Go ahead, Juan.
Oh,
Thank you, Ann. Am I behind you on the screen? Where am I? Jeff, thank you for a terrific presentation. I just want to hit a couple of highlights. I'm with the South Bay Cities Council of Governments, and we are absolutely passionate about the climate change and resilience and all things related. And so I really appreciate hearing that the Democratic is featuring climate, because it's the issue of our time. So the carbon pricing that we talked about is absolutely essential. And I think that the carbon cashback program sounds just really terrific and excellent and necessary if we're going to proceed with it. You mentioned that the local California chapter is also interested in focusing on developing effective demonstration, affecting legislation. And, you know, that's where we start to have problems. In fact, I would say, try to follow the money through all of this, because the closer that you get to the ground where things happen, the more difficult it gets, the more resistance you find, and the more ineffective the legislative battles really are. And so time is one of them. I'm glad you mentioned the idea of the time required for permits for energy projects. I find in my work that almost no institution is recognizing the timeline for disaster. As I understand it from the scientists, and this is my understanding, that we have at most till 2030 and maybe 2028 before, in order to stop the growth of carbon emissions. That is a zero carbon kind of way of putting it. We have to stop increasing it before we can decreasing it. And we must do that by 2028 or 2030, or the various carbon sinks start to release the carbon. That's melting up the glaciers, of course, the oceans, the forests. So this is more urgent than what any of the institutions are recognizing. They're stuck in business as usual, and they don't have any concept of having to move quickly. So in terms of effective state laws, I see that we have two kinds of problems. We have state legislature who is following false narrative, and they do stuff that is ridiculous, under the guise of reducing carbon. The other is they turn it over to the various state agencies to implement. Boy, that's really where you run into the problem, because the bureaucratic, they're all in silos and they're all bureaucrats. They don't move fast, and they don't actually follow very closely into, they don't follow the legislation all that closely, and they make mistakes. I'll give you an example. The IRA put a ton of money into electric vehicle subsidies, and the State Air Resources Board turns that around into subsidy for full-speed, large battery vehicles. If the targets are met with these only these full-speed vehicles, large battery vehicles, it will delay the conversion to independence of renewable energy, because the demand for electricity will be so great, it will exceed the capacity to produce it through renewables. So we have taken, on several occasions, to the Air Resources Board the whole idea of micro-mobility, which is golf carts, let's say. Now, we know from our research that 70% of the trips in the South Bay are under 3 miles. So what we're trying to say is, why don't you give subsidies to these golf carts that are $10,000, $8,000? You can put so many of them on the road with the same $1 billion or $100 million you want to spend, and it absolutely fits what the actual travel needs of people are. But people don't understand. Residents don't understand. So they all want a big car, and then that big car sits there for 90-some% of the time. It costs a lot of money, and Air Resources Board will not subsidize small battery vehicles, even though it is in service to the environment. So there's a lot of different examples. I can talk about Metro and what they're doing. I can talk about SCAG at another time and what they're doing, but it all gets mangled the closer you get to the ground. And so I would urge all advocates to kind of follow the money all the way from the federal legislation through the state, what they do with it, what the bureaucrats do with it, and then what happens to some of our local agencies. Because as I said, the closer when I give a talk on the climate, I have my favorite opening slide is a guy who's painted himself into a corner in a room, and he's turning his back to the paint and he's looking at the corner of the room as if he doesn't even know he's painted himself in the corner. That is kind of where we're at. And I want to urge all the advocates to really pay attention to what happens locally and regionally, because that's where the money gets squandered. It's not effective. So comments, please. Jeff, do you have a comment?
Oh, I think you made some really good points, and thank you for making them.
All right. Any more questions in the room? I think we're.
Okay.
Can I make just a
Oh, go ahead.
small announcement?
Sure.
If anybody has an electric car here, you can charge the electric car on the rooftop of this building. And in less time than the talk, you can go from 20% to 80% charge up at Verify Electrica, right on top of this building.
Thank you. Good to know. Okay. Anything else you'd like to say, Connie? Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more about AB 858 because I've been lobbying for it. This is Al Maritsuchi's bill. He reached out to CTL in late 2021, and this is after conferring with him and us, we decided this is the way we could make inroads and kind of create a carbon fee and dividend in California. And we've always talked about how pricing carbon is so important in order to reduce greenhouse gases and get them to the point where we need to get them and meet our commitments. But we kind of didn't talk as much about the cashback piece of it. And the cashback piece really needs to be married to the pricing piece, or the public will not accept it. We saw what happened in France when Macron tried to raise carbon taxes and the people rose up. He wasn't offering a cashback along with it. When we look at Canada, Canada has a carbon fee and dividend program in place. Trudeau has run twice, and he's made that a centerpiece of his election both times, and the people have accepted it. You look at Washington State, they put in a carbon pricing mechanism without a cashback provision, and now the people are complaining, and they're not supporting the pricing mechanism anymore, which is so necessary in order to reduce our greenhouse gases. So we've kind of, I believe, given short shrift to how important the cashback is. I personally think it should be given to everyone. I understand why it's aimed at lower income first, but we want broad support for carbon pricing, and we won't get that without this piece, and that's why Al Maritsuchi's 858 is so important. Just wanted to hammer that home a little.
Thank you. All right, I think unless there's are there any more announcements that in terms of not on this subject, but anything else anybody else has to offer? Connie, do you have any last announcements, or otherwise we can end the meeting?
We can adjourn the meeting.
Okay, thank you all for coming.